The world before the creation of the heavens and the earth was a boundless sea. In the midst of this great sea rose the island of Santnar. This island was the embodiment of the true blessing of the goddess who ruled over these lands. It was a place where beauty and grace were in the air, permeating everywhere. In that world, like a bright star, a city sparkled, which was saturated with luxury and pleasure. However, even in such a place there was a downside. A kind of garbage pit where all the dirt was poured. Kimura slums. And the reality there was completely different. Here, base instincts and the struggle for survival prevailed. Cursing and the sound of blows could be heard in the dark alley. Several men detained the boy, who desperately resisted and tried to escape. The man with the dark mustache leaned toward the little criminal. Calling the boy by the name Abel, he assumed that he was simply pretending to be mute. The child looked out from under his cap, hatred and despair. The main one who had detained the boy grabbed the collar of his tattered shirt. The old fabric couldn't withstand the strain and cracked, revealing a neat female breast. Thus, the rumors were confirmed that the scoundrel was a woman. More precisely, a young girl with a very attractive body. But the face was disgusting. Obscene glances immediately turned to the desperately resisting teenager. Despair and fear did their job. A fragment of a bottle with sharp, deadly edges flashed in a thin hand. With one hand, the girl held the torn edge of her shirt, and with the other she waved a broken bottle. In despair, she screamed at her offenders to get away. A rough hand squeezed her shoulder hard. The mustachioed man growled in the unfortunate woman's face, calling her an ungrateful creature. After all, he had shown kindness by taking her into his care. The weak child could barely support herself by just cleaning shoes all that time. New insults rained down, accompanied by blows to the face and cuffs all over the body. The enraged man hissed that he was giving her a week's time. During this period, she had to pay for her patronage by returning all her debts. Otherwise, you will have to deal not with shoes and fists but with rude men. The next few days, the girl was desperately wondering where to get money and what to do next. All that came to mind was cleaning shoes. But you can't earn much with such a craft. Often the shoeshine girl worked in the Piazza San Salina. After all, there you could meet rich customers. They could take pity and give you a coin on top of the fee. This was the case this time. Two young men were sitting on a bench having a lively conversation. One of them was holding today's newspaper, Vesnik Santnar. The one holding the newspaper was complaining to his friend that there were less than 2 days left, and he had absolutely no idea what to do. A girl dressed as a boy polished a stranger's expensive shoes until they shone. All her thoughts were about one thing: money. After all, if she doesn't settle accounts with the patron saint of cleaners, there's only one way out. She'll be sent to a brothel. A terrible fate, it would have been better to die. From her place at the rich gentleman's feet, the shabby girl could see the expensive outfit. The gold-embroidered collar shone in the rays of the sun. Meanwhile, the Lord was thinking about taking Lucretia by the hand and leading her into the ceremonial hall. The thought alone was unbearable. Suddenly, the shoe-shine girl's gaze involuntarily fell on the front page of the newspaper in the gentleman's hands. From the photograph on the spread, the very man who was sitting right in front of her was looking out. The shoe brush almost slipped out of my hands in surprise. My eyes refused to believe what I saw. The man was none other than Cesare Buonaparte himself, the brightest star of the nobility and the hero of countless love scandals. There was talk that Cesare had finally met his destiny, which turned out to be the youngest daughter of the Della Valle family, Lucrezia. The public's attention was drawn to this union. The girl chose as her husband the only heir of Bonaparte. In the distant past, these two influential families made a marriage contract. The entire beau monde congratulated Lucretia on the fact that her long-standing, unrequited love had finally borne fruit. The young man crumpled the newspaper with force. He was beside himself with rage and accused his fiancée of lying. He knew in advance that she was a notorious intriguer. No one paid any attention to the girl dressed in men's clothing. The cap pulled low hid the beads of sweat that appeared on her face. It was impossible to even imagine that one would meet such an important person in the Piazza San Salina. Suddenly, a swarm of thoughts began to swirl in the commoner's head. If she explained her difficult situation, perhaps the master would take pity and throw in a few gold coins. The two friends, leisurely lighting cigars, continued their conversation. They mentioned some crazy plan, that the best idea was to find a decent girl and sell her to Della Valle. The shoeshine girl perked up, because this wasn't just a chance to sort things out with a few gold coins. This was the last chance, given to her by the goddess herself. Not expecting such courage from herself, she cried out, Sell me, promising to become the most expensive lady in Santnar. The cigar almost fell out of the young man's hands in surprise. The friends asked almost simultaneously what this shabby woman was talking about. After all, their professional specialty should be the ability to determine people's class by their shoes. It was obvious that the rich gentleman was mocking the common miss. But she interrupted Mr. Cesare, saying that she had identified everything correctly, and immediately introduced herself. Out of habit, she gave her male name, Abel, and then Adele Vivi corrected herself. The girl insisted that she could play the role the master needed better than anyone else. The young man's eyes showed distrust. After all, someone like this shabby girl could not understand the plans of the heir of the Bonaparte family. However, the cleaner understood that he needed a false daughter of the Bonaparte family, who could be sent to the Della Valle family in his place. The gentleman was shocked, and did not understand from whom this person could hear such a thing. However, the girl assured that she had come to this conclusion after reading the newspaper, and she continued to say that in the marriage contract made public by Della Valle only 2 wealthy families figure. However, no specific names were given, and also concluded that the Lord wants to free himself from a political marriage, to try to deceive everyone by buying a girl and calling her the secret daughter of the Bonaparte family. And for these purposes, a girl is absolutely necessary, since there is still one unmarried son left in the Della Valle family. The other rich gentleman laughed. He was surprised that the girl had guessed everything just by reading the newspaper. It was incredible. But Signor Cesare did not share his friend's joy. It was a futile undertaking. After all, great scientists have come from the Della Valle family since time immemorial, and these are not the kind of people to whom you can simply send a shoeshine girl who can barely read. The girl started speaking a foreign language. She claimed that she had much more skills than just reading. Both friends were extremely surprised. After all, she spoke the Melon language. They were also informed about her knowledge of the Algisa language. Young people vied with each other to ask how someone like her could learn foreign languages, but she only assured that she had read books in the public library and had briefly listened to the speeches of foreigners. It was impossible to believe their ears. It felt like the sea goddess herself was playing a joke on them. In conclusion, the gentleman turned to Adele Vivi, saying that not only the content but also the wrapper is important. After all, the product must look perfect. And both gentlemen walked away with an important air, and the shoe-cleaning lady remained kneeling, surrounded by her brushes. The only chance was floating away like a ghost. In desperation, the girl called out to the important gentleman. Turning around, they saw a completely different person at the shoeshine stand. The cap was gone, and the face was clean of dirt. Instead of a young man with a cap pulled down over his eyes, a pretty black-haired girl was looking at them. Her gaze was bold and attractive at the same time. Her long, tousled hair framed her sweet young face. For a few seconds, Signor Cesare hesitated. After all, this little girl had offered to pretend to be his sister. But after thinking about it, he finally agreed. The color of the hair and eyes of both were quite similar, simply an ideal representative of the Bonaparte family. Then the gentleman began to question the girl about her origin, family, and parents. But Adele Vivi was an orphan and knew absolutely nothing about her father and mother. The young man thought about it. He was overcome with curiosity about why an ordinary fool needed all this. After all, if the deception was revealed, she would simply be killed. But the girl looked the Lord straight in the eye and very openly admitted that she was simply hungry. Life is not sweet for an orphan. It was then that the final decision was made, sending now at the appointed hour to meet at the same place. And then something incredible happened. The frumpy one continued his words with a phrase from Dante's play, "Where we desired each other." It seemed she would really be useful to the family. Without wasting any time, a meeting was arranged for the following day at noon at the Bonaparte estate. It poured rain all night, as if the elements had decided to remind the commoner of the hard life in the slums. But the sounds of thunder did not frighten. They only brought back the events of the previous day more vividly. I still could not believe what had happened. Cesare Buonaparte himself accepted her offer. The issue with the cleaner's patron was resolved by itself. There was no longer any need to worry about the brothel. However, it was all worth keeping secret. Even his only friend Clarice could not be told the secret. But it was still worth warning. As always, she was busy this evening. It was possible to leave a note in the little room where the girls lived. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door of the hut. At such a late hour, there could only be one person, old Nino, the patron saint of cleaners. The unfortunate girl was gripped by fear. She seemed to have even stopped breathing from horror. The door swung open from the blows. The heavy-set silhouette of her boss became clearly visible in the dark opening. He was terribly furious. His dark mustache bristled with anger. It was not for nothing that he came to check whether the debtor had run away. Grabbing the girl's hand painfully, he tried to drag the orphan out of the little room. The boor's obscene thoughts were clearly visible on his distorted face. With a force that came from nowhere, the girl hit the hated man in the face. The man's tenacious fingers involuntarily unclenched. The girl jumped onto the table by the window. The bony hand of the boor almost grabbed the runaway's wide trouser leg. Curses and abuse were heard behind her. But fear did not allow her to stop for a second. After all, if what Signor Cesare had planned were to come to light, she would not live anyway. Better such a death than the shame of a rapist in a dirty hovel. Pushing off with all her might, the unfortunate woman jumped out of the wide-open window, straight into the darkness of the night under the pouring rain. If it was possible, she was ready to risk her life for a normal future. Exactly at noon the next day, Adele stood hesitantly at the gate of a rich mansion. A man in a black suit and bow tie bowed in greeting. He was the butler at the Bonaparte estate named Ernst. Having invited the stunned girl to come in, he said that the head of the family was already waiting in his office. The light from the high windows illuminated the rich furnishings of the office. Signor Cesare sat at the table, sorting through papers. The shabby woman seemed out of place in such a rich place. Her clothes were worn and not entirely clean. The gentleman looked up at the woman who had entered. Smiling, he noted that she didn't look very good. Her clothes were soaking wet and her body was shaking like a leaf in the wind. He asked to share with his older brother what happened to his younger sister. Bursting into tears, the girl told her story. About Mr. Nino, who was the patron saint of all shoeshiners in Camorra. About persecution for late payment for patronage, and for threats to give the girl to a brothel. The gentleman closed his eyes and dryly reported that the old man from the slums was dead. Adele couldn't believe what she heard. She couldn't utter a single word, and her whole body felt like it was on fire. Meanwhile, the man continued to say that it rained heavily all night, and one of the shacks gave in and collapsed. Accidental deaths are quite common in Camorra. Squinting slyly, he asked if there was even one more bug that could interfere with the matter. The girl, wiping away her tears, assured that there was no one else. She did not want to mention her friend. The señor smiled and assured them that there was nothing to worry about, but only until the moment when their plan could go wrong. Now it was necessary to move on to the main thing. The goal known to her was to seduce the son of the Della Valle family and marry him. But you have to start with her body and mind, the way she speaks and carries herself, and finish with the tips of her fingers and toes. That is, to become the ideal representative of the Bonaparte family. To fool the entire Fornati high society. Lighting a cigar, the gentleman continued that there was only 3 months to do everything. But if within that time she doesn't become the lady he recognizes, the plan will go to waste. Tears welled up in her eyes again and she held her breath. After all, if the plan failed, then she herself would go to the trash heap after her. Cesare put out his cigar and asked the girl if she knew why the 3-month deadline had been set. The clever commoner suggested that the event was planned to coincide with the date of the reception, in honor of the birthday of the heir of the Cesare family. The gentleman was again amazed. This girl clearly had a talent for uncovering his plans, relying only on newspaper articles. There was a feeling that she knew even more about Signor Cesare's family than the representative of the Buonaparte family himself. Suddenly the man lifted the girl's chin and looked intently into her amber eyes. Perhaps there was another reason, and this scoundrel was interested in him. It was clear that for a country bumpkin from the slums, who only had a pretty face, a rich gentleman seemed like a messiah. And the newly acquired brother could be the one she wanted to cling to. But the man clearly warned that he did not want to see her one night in his bedroom. The girl protestingly opened her mouth to shout a denial in his face, but she held back. She only quietly whispered that she was grateful for the advice, but the gentleman was of no interest to her at all. And emboldened, she added that such a handsome man as he was a little crazy. The gentleman burst into laughter. That expression, both beautiful and evil, suited her so well. But then, in the most serious tone, he warned that such cases had already happened in his life. Adele assured her master that she understood everything, but he corrected her by saying that he was now the older brother, and that was exactly how he should be called. Having difficulty pronouncing the word brother, I received an encouraging sister in response. Seated in a soft armchair, the newly made brother continued to instruct his relative. Her name was now Adelaide Bonaparte, 5 years younger than her brother. All this time she lived in distant Kapalo somewhere overseas, considering herself a commoner. And suddenly, for some unknown reason, she decided to come to Santnar alone. The girl tried not to miss the slightest detail, so she had to adapt to the situation. That was the idea. But there was another member of the Buonaparte family, Cesare's grandmother. Eva Buonaparte held the high post of president of the Signoria, that is, she was the head of parliament. Without the consent of this powerful lady, it was impossible to even begin the planned project. But the man assured that there was no point in involving Mrs. Eva in this matter. After all, she wanted grandchildren more than anything in the world, and she was ready to accept Lucretia with open arms. And therefore she supported this marriage with all her heart. Cesare lit his cigar and asked with pain in his voice if the girl had asked all the questions. After all, the most important one, about the gentleman's parents, had not been asked. And for a family member it is important to know even the smallest details. But she did not ask about it. The girl looked down because there wasn't a single person in Santana who didn't know this sad story. There were rumors that Cesare's parents were mad with love for each other. The couple ran away hand in hand, abandoning their powerful families and their young child. No more news came of the two. All this happened in the year when young Cesare was barely 9 years old. There was nothing to add. No further clarification was required on this issue. At the end of his lesson, the young man suggested telling everyone that Adelaide was the youngest daughter of love-struck parents. The memories tormented my soul painfully, so I had to end the conversation. The man headed towards the door and, turning around, said dryly that the maid was waiting for her mistress. The girl didn't notice at all how the evening twilight made everything around her gray. Only a bright light from another hall was shining through. The man's silhouette in the doorway was magnificent. His white cambric shirt emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist. Stopping in the doorway, Cesare smiled and expressed hope that his next meeting would be with a lady. He was looking forward to it. He hoped that the student would quickly learn the lessons of social life. Adele froze. She didn't believe everything that was happening to her. She only quietly said that she would do her best. Her assigned maid was already waiting outside the door. She introduced herself as Effie Corer, and it was a great honor for her to serve Lady Adelaide. A long corridor led to a huge hall, striking in its beauty. The marble floor reflected the rich decoration of the room. Antique furniture emphasized the exquisite taste of the owners. The maid said that this room now belonged to a lady, and she complained that the Bonapartes rejected luxury, so the decor could not be called chic. Rather comfortable, although I thought that the furnishings were too modest for a young lady's chambers. Adele couldn't believe her eyes. It was something she had never dreamed of. The room looked like a fairy tale palace. And she also had a maid who informed her that etiquette classes would begin tomorrow, and the young lady should not have a cold under any circumstances. After all, wet, dirty clothes could easily provoke this problem. Therefore, it is urgent to take a bath. And she pointed to a huge steaming bathtub with rose petals on the surface of the water. For a simple girl from the slums, it was impossible for anyone to help her. After all, it was not every day that she was able to wash herself with clean water in her hovel. But the maid was adamant. She insisted that this was part of the training. And in fact, Effie's assistant's words were not a request. The well-worn shirt slid to the floor. The girl bashfully covered her neat chest. Her entire body was covered in bruises. Some of them were already fading and had a yellowish tint. Others were clearly fresh with burgundy bruises. The assistant looked at the trembling, thin body with horror. But the girl lifted her chin and said that the bruises would quickly disappear. After all, she knew this from experience, because she often received punches and beatings. And then there would be no traces left. Suddenly, panic gripped her whole body. Most likely, the maid would report this to the master and he would break the contract, considering her body ugly. But she assured that the contract would end only after the young lady's wedding with Della Valle's son. Until then, all that was needed was to keep the secret and not be discovered by the young master of that clan. A sigh of relief escaped her lips, and the girl gave praise to the goddess of the sea. Until then, she needs to focus on restoring her health and bringing her emaciated body back to normal. After all, she is now Lady Bonaparte. In the reflection of the water, a thin girl with huge amber eyes and lush dark hair looked at her. Almost a child, but with the features of a young beauty. In the office, in front of Mr. Cesare, who was sitting in a chair, a maid was reporting on how things were going. That the young lady's health leaves much to be desired. with numerous bruises and beatings and unnatural thinness. He couldn't believe everything he heard. After all, a chipped pearl is worthless. The whole plan was falling apart before his eyes. However, Effie's maid assured that there was no reason to panic. With proper treatment, the bruises would disappear without a trace. And when the lady gained a little weight, her beauty would outshine many. Cesare thought about these words, because even now the girl was beautiful. And it was a bit of a pity that they were now relatives, and he assured her that he had no intention of touching her. But an evil voice in his head reminded him that the victim would die as soon as the problem was solved. The window overlooked the facade of a luxurious mansion, as well as part of the port. It was early morning and the sun was just about to rise over the horizon. Adele woke up early in the morning, as was her habit, and immediately saw a line of ships entering the port. They had been working all night and were now returning with a rich catch. Soon some fishermen will start distributing the fish they didn't sell to anyone in need in the harbor. Many times the girl also wandered along the pier early in the morning in the hope of catching the distribution. After all, the most frequent feeling in her joyless life was hunger. And also humiliation. Now, standing at the window in these luxurious rooms, she could not believe what was happening. After all, just a few days ago, her world was the bottom of the Camorra slums. But then doubts crept in as to whether there would be enough strength and skill to cope with everything planned. It would have been impossible to fall asleep anyway, and Adele took a book from the shelf to distract herself from her obsessive thoughts. The maid found her doing this. Entering the room, she made sure that the lady was awake. She immediately asked if the bedroom was not suitable for rest, or the bed was not soft enough, but the girl assured that she was used to waking up early, and in a voice full of enthusiasm, she asked about plans for today. The assistant noted that from today on there would not be a single free hour in their schedule, and they had to start with a meal. The young lady put on a blue velvet dress embroidered with lace and combed her thick hair properly, and she was completely ready to begin her studies. In the dining room, a huge table was set for breakfast with many different utensils, coasters, and napkins. The embroidered tablecloth was snow white. The maid pulled out a chair, inviting the student to sit down. The lesson began with finding out the culinary preferences of the student, but the ward, embarrassed, replied that she had never even thought about it. The only thing she didn't really like was rotten food. But in general, anything would do. The absence of preferences was a good quality for a noble lady, Madame thought. And she added that table etiquette was one of the obligatory skills for nobles. It was the foundation of foundations. In front of the confused girl there was an innumerable number of plates, forks, and knives of different shapes and sizes. The teacher taught that it was necessary to use the outermost utensils when starting a meal. It was necessary to maintain posture, raise the chin. Elbows should not touch the tabletop. The strict lady praised the student. She said that it was turning out quite well. Now she was offered to try the first course. Adele's head was spinning. She had never seen such a variety of food and drink in her life. The mind-blowing smells were not even worth mentioning. The exquisite names followed one another. Beef carpaccio with arugula, linguine with mackerel and abalone, halibut with potato gratin and tomato sauce. Every dish was simply superb. Suddenly, the pleasure turned to fear. Suddenly, she was eating too greedily like some kind of slum tramp. But the assistant praised her appetite. She said that for some time it was necessary to eat 4 times a day. After all, a noble lady should be in shape. Now a tour of the mansion was in store. The library, reception room, art gallery, billiard room were shown. Each room caused the girl genuine delight. In the central area of the first floor was the master's office, and if a lady needed to visit it, she had to enter without knocking. That was the rule of the mansion. Adele was dizzy from everything that was happening. However, she wondered if there was anything to be wary of. Well, the maid decided to report it right away. The circle of people who knew about the contract between the young lady and the young master numbered 6 people, including Effie herself. However, in a few days another person will be added. This will be the etiquette teacher, Madame Flavia. She is somewhat strict but has the best competence. It was necessary to listen to her without fail. The girl was a little confused. She didn't even know how to greet Madame. However, the maid came to the rescue. In Fornati, it was necessary to greet like this. Holding the skirt, you had to bend your knees, keep your back straight. At the same time, you had to bow your head. The student immediately performed a welcoming curtsy. It turned out quite well. She grasped everything on the fly. In the young lady's private chambers, The evening twilight cast a soft blue light over everything. The atmosphere itself was conducive to a restful sleep. Looking into the bedroom, the teacher wished good night to her student. She responded in kind, wishing for the protection of the goddess of the sea. The girl was left alone in her luxurious bed, and she couldn't calm the thoughts swarming in her head. Just a couple of days ago, only screams and noise were Kimora's constant companions. Now, a ringing silence guarded her peace. It turns out that there was a world where it was so calm and good, where you could eat hot food and sleep in silence. And for some, it was commonplace. Someone was calling her name, screaming for the girl to run away. The black foam around her seemed to choke her. Fear paralyzed her body. Adele opened her eyes. The sudden screams brought her out of her sleep. It turned out that someone was really calling her name loudly. It was the maid Effany. Her face was worried and her whole appearance said that something bad had happened, and she was called by the name of Madame Flavia. She unexpectedly arrived at the mansion for a visit. Time was running out. Something urgently needed to be thrown over the shoulders. The maid hurried the sleepy girl, and at the same time she hastily told who was the cause of such a commotion. For several generations, the Bonaparte family was served by representatives of the noble ancient Laurent family, but Flavia Laurendon's name was the loudest in social circles. She was known for being like a work of art, thanks to her beauty and elegance. Also on everyone's lips was the obstinate nature and excessive strictness in the training of young ladies. This is exactly what the middle-aged lady who flew into the bedroom demonstrated. She was wearing a wide hat and a suit with a strict collar. A cane with a knob gleamed in her hands. In a commanding voice, she asked what kind of inappropriate appearance the young shameless lady had. Adele was embarrassed. She could only mumble words of apology. But her justification speech was immediately interrupted. After all, no one allowed this impudent girl to speak. Absolute ignorance of manners and rules. The strict lady was beside herself with anger. It was this girl who had to be taught at least something. The girl stood, holding her hastily thrown-on robe with her hand. Her head was lowered. They did not allow her to say anything. But help came in the form of a young gentleman who appeared at the bedroom door. He cooled the ardor of the strict teacher with just one phrase. If the young lady had known etiquette, there would have been no need for a professional's help. The man crossed his arms over his chest. He added that he had not expected Madame Flavia so early. The newcomer's face instantly changed beyond recognition. Politely removing her hat, Madame headed towards Mr. Cesare. At the same time, she was trying to say something, but he only demonstratively kissed the dear guest on the cheek, although she tried to move away. But the signor immediately asked if Madame Flavia had slept well on the road at night. According to the rules of good manners, one could not openly demonstrate one's feelings. The teacher tried to babble appropriate answers, but the signor confused her with the following phrase. He invited me to join him for breakfast, but then he noticed that the entire schedule of classes was scheduled down to the minute. At the same time, he smiled charmingly. Madame's cheeks turned pink with slight embarrassment. After all, the techniques that made girls give their hearts to Signor Cesare had been demonstrated. Then the ladies' man casually remarked that perhaps the guest was planning to take a bath. In that case, he was forced to leave. The teacher choked with indignation. The gentleman should not have said such careless words. After all, that impudent woman could have heard them and come up with stupid things. These words drove Adele crazy. It would be nice to know the position of the impudent woman herself, and only then reason. The gentleman stood up for the girl. Smiling, he assured her that she would not say anything, and this slightly hurt the male ego. The lady was furious. In a loud voice, she declared that the girl should not dare to raise her head. Her eyes were throwing sparks, and the heel of her elegant shoes hit the floor. Coming closer, the imperious lady saw the ugly traces of bruises on the girl's body. In the light of the morning sun, they were especially visible, but she assured me that the bruises would go away. This had happened many times. There would be no marks left on the body. The gentleman seriously noted that this misunderstanding would not be an obstacle to a clearly developed plan. But Madame Flavia did not calm down. In a disdainful tone, she assured that this scoundrel was not suitable for the job. After all, it was still unknown where such a woman could hang out. She sold her body. She could be beaten, leaving scars on her body. People like her are lazy and have no inner core. Even in 100 years, it is impossible to teach them anything. And this particular person simply wants to raise her status using her body. It seemed as if the ground had slipped from under the poor girl's feet. The insults and grievances from everyone who was even slightly higher in status than her came to mind. And that was everyone. But suddenly the words seemed to escape her lips. She apologized and said that she understood her incompetence, but she would do her best to teach. The lady turned around and hissed in the unfortunate woman's face that no matter how hard you try, it's impossible to hide your origin. You can't fool the eyes of those who were born and raised in high society. She asked how one could have acquired arrogance while vegetating at the bottom, but the impudent girl did not give up. Yes, the girl grew up without parents and did not receive a decent education. However, her brother believed that she had the power to cope and deceive everyone. That is why she is here. So let Madame speak to Signor Cesare personally, since she believes that he was mistaken in his judgments. These were very bold words. Even more, Adele was embarrassed and immediately apologized. However, the powerful lady could not cope with her raging emotions. She hit the mirror floor with her cane and began shouting insults. Cesare was still standing in the doorway, silently observing everything that was happening. However, he cleared his throat and interrupted the furious Madame's tirade. She came to her senses instantly. Embarrassed, she stammered that she had completely forgotten about the appointed meeting, and quickly left. The gentleman approached, a toothy smile shining on his face. He said in a joking tone that his sister, it turns out, is no slouch. Feelings overwhelmed me, and thoughts flashed with incredible speed. Having thanked the gentleman for his help, I was immediately afraid that he would see bruises on my fair skin. But the man noted that Madame Flavia had a tough character, and the young lady should have been more meek. Then everything would have gone more smoothly. Adele lifted her chin. Was he trying to say that she should have pretended to be pathetic? However, the man cynically noted that there was no need to pretend. The scruffy girl's entire life had been miserable, so this was already an unchangeable fact. And he suggested considering everything that happened as a performance, where each scene had its own consequences. There was such pain in the girl's eyes, as if the whole world had collapsed. Of course, these cruel words were true, but suddenly the thought flashed through my mind that what had happened was a provocation. Just to see the reaction. It would take all her strength not to show her pain. She certainly wasn't going to become a court jester. The gentleman cast an arrogant glance at the girl and quickly left the room. Only the edge of his gold-embroidered jacket flashed in the field of vision of his lowered amber eyes. The young gentleman very quickly lost all interest in the girl, as well as in many other young ladies. The next morning began as usual with a visit from the maid, who smiled encouragingly, and told that Madame Flavia had returned to continue her studies. At the end of the huge hall with marble columns stood a teacher in her usual strict attire. In her hands was a cane with a knob. The maid whispered in Adele's ear that if the Lord had something in mind, it would certainly be fulfilled. The teacher gave her student a contemptuous look. She pronounced her first and last name clearly, Adelaide Bonaparte, and she added that such a noble name was unworthy of such a person, and the goddess of the sea herself would be angry if she saw the great blue star on the chest of the impudent girl. Contempt was evident in the look of the piercing eyes. This person should have been taught a proper lesson, instead of being made a real lady out of her. Ordering him to kneel, she swung her cane as if intending to strike. All her life, the poor beggar woman had been the one to take out her anger. This madam was no exception. After all, the unfortunate woman was not of noble origin, but a simple shoe shiner. And the lady probably wanted to hurt the commoner with such an attitude, but it seems she chose the wrong way. After all, kneeling was quite common for cleaners. Then the evil lady put her foot in an expensive shoe on the knee of this beggar. The heel of the shoe painfully pressed against the knee. At the same time, contemptuous words echoed in the huge hall about how the girl was a commodity and her only purpose was to be quietly sold to the Della Valle family. And if he dares to dream of something more, he will end up as food for sharks. She poked her cane into the thin shoulder and declared that this was the girl's place. Adele had no choice but to agree. To correct the ugly gait, a new pair of shoes was needed. Low-heeled shoes were to be worn at all times, not just in class. With trembling hands, the student took a pair of brand-new black shoes and tried them on. These were the first new shoes I ever had, and they were so beautiful. A little too small for my needs, but still gorgeous. Madame ordered to stand up and start walking around the huge hall from one end to the other until she allowed to stop. Unaccustomed to it, her legs got tangled in the folds of her wide dress. The girl was so tired that every step was difficult. She fell several times, twisting her ankle. Having tried to say that I was tired, I immediately received an angry response. so that I wouldn't dare complain during the sacred lesson. Madame was jubilant, because she was about to shout that the shabby girl was not worthy of the great name of Bonaparte and drive the stubborn woman away. But the exhausted student stood up and walked around the huge hall again, step by step, to infinity. The feet in the narrow shoes were burning like fire. This torture had been going on for several hours without a break. After another circle, Madame decided that it was time to stop this idea. Turning to the maid, she ordered her to leave. The maid had been in the hall all this time. However, Mrs. Effany refused. After all, the young master had ordered her not to leave the lady's side for a single step. The teacher softened a little, saying that she was not going to spank the student, and she swore on the name of Lorendin. The maid left the hall, closing the massive door behind her. The teacher turned around and looked at the embarrassed girl. She told the shoeshine girl to leave the mansion, but she was not embarrassed. After all, what was said completely contradicted the intentions of the gentleman who brought her here. The indignant lady ordered not to interrupt. Compared to Bonaparte, the Delavalle family were not such a chic match for marriage. And yet they were certainly superior to such a lazy and narrow-minded person as this. Realizing her situation, the scruffy girl had to leave, and the mentor promised her protection and a small reward for this. But the young lady was not at a loss. It seemed that Madame wished for the young gentleman to marry Lady Lucretia. But they hired the teacher for the exact opposite purpose, to do everything to fulfill her brother's will. Having asked for forgiveness, she said that she was forced to report everything that had happened to the master. However, the powerful lady declared that it was the will of Madame Eva Bonaparte to marry her grandson to Lady Lucrezia. To do this, use an ancient history, a contract between two ancient families. Only this contract could force the young lady's man to marry. After all, countless women were looking at Signor Cesare. However, he still couldn't settle down, and he continued to behave like a little child. So, such a noble line could well end without the appearance of heirs. And this could not be allowed. So there's no point in such a frumpy girl getting involved in the Battle of the Titans. Adele was shaking all over from what she heard. She thanked Madame for the warning, and said that she still couldn't carry out her order. But she got furious, because she had misinterpreted the answer. She decided that the impudent woman was simply asking for more money. Then the girl admitted that her motive was not money, but the fact that there was very tasty food in the mansion. After all, money and the future are something ephemeral. For those who are constantly in need, the future is like a mirage, which you can't eat right now. The enraged lady shouted that the stupid girl forgot her mind for a piece of pie, like the base habits of an animal. However, it was the truth. Constantly hungry, there was nothing else to do. Sometimes the girl couldn't sleep because of it. Often a crust of bread was the only food she got during the day. Madame Flavia walked away, maintaining perfect posture. The impudent woman's words touched some inner feelings. This little devil was skinny, bruised, and her gait left much to be desired. However, she already radiated tenderness and elegance, and she was wearing those shoes. And for some reason, my imagination pictured a girl in the arms of a young gentleman. I had to urgently find another way. A whole week of classes has already passed. Time flew by very quickly in a series of lessons. They studied etiquette, speech delivery, and social conversation. Also, the rules of communication with ladies who were higher in status. Learn to politely but firmly refuse intrusive advances from gentlemen. The least favorite lesson was practicing your gait. You had to walk in these narrow shoes that constrained your feet. The maid was very worried about the student's feet, but she did not show that she was in pain or distress. Effany was sure that the young lady's gait was almost perfect. The etiquette teacher saw it too. The speed of learning increased with each passing day. The girl absorbed knowledge like a sponge. There was still much to learn, but even now it was impossible to assume that the lady was from a lower class. One day, Adele and her maid were walking in the park. Suddenly, they saw a group of girls. They were chatting and giggling a little to the side. The young lady had never seen them before. It turned out that they were members of the delegation from Orkanen. Mrs. Effany felt sorry for her charge. Constant lessons left no time even to read the news. A few days ago, the second prince ascended the throne of Orkanen. This happened with the support of Lord Cesare. It took a lot of effort. After all, the prince had no support in the palace. But in the end, everything worked out. For this help, Emperor Orkanina generously rewarded the young master. A whole retinue arrived. So now the estate was lively. It turned out that the brother had a very broad sphere of influence, even broader than one could have imagined, to influence the succession to the throne in a foreign country. Suddenly, the girls came to life. They were standing close to the marble rotunda and were the first to see the Duke. He greeted him affably. He paid attention to each lady. The girls babbled shyly that they were looking for the young gentleman in the park. Adele also saw her brother. He was magnificent in his light walking suit, the darling of fate and the favorite of the gods. A ladies' man and a man to be praised, as if he were the sea goddess. However, it was noticeable that there was no interest in the gentleman's eyes at all. Rather, there was emptiness. His gaze seemed to be looking through the girls. The maid hurried her charge. They had to leave immediately. After all, they could be noticed in the shadow of the trees. Suddenly, the young man turned his head in their direction. The flock of girls also became animated. There was probably something interesting there. The young man said that it was a mermaid. But there was one next to him. The man covered the eyes of one of the girls with light golden hair with his hand. She was embarrassed and called the gentleman a joker. Then the gentleman leaned down to the very ear with the ruby earring and whispered that he was expecting the lady at his place this evening. The blonde was embarrassed but promised to think about it. However, on the condition that the gentleman had serious intentions regarding her, Cesare immediately lost interest in the beauty. It seemed it was time to put an end to all this. After all that was needed was a one-night stand. No serious relationship. Although her light golden hair seemed so alluring, but the feeling evaporated somewhere. It was sweet and impudent. The girl was extremely disappointed. The earrings in her neat ears trembled nervously, but suddenly the beauty agreed to come. However, the womanizer had already lost interest in this. He quickly left the company of girls. The young gentleman lit a cigar and slowly approached the place where he noticed Adele with her maid. Not seeing the ladies in the shade of the trees, the gentleman moved towards the center of the park, and suddenly he heard a woman's scream. Coming closer, Cesare saw that his sister was standing in the fountain, knee-deep in water. Her hand was tightly clutched by a young man. His intentions were obvious, and the following story happened. Adele, accompanied by a maid, approached the fountain in the center of the park. The girl was noticeably limping. Every step was difficult, and at some point her tired legs couldn't take it anymore and the poor thing fell onto the path. Mrs. Effany asked her companion to show her feet. They were worn raw with swollen, bloody calluses. It was impossible to walk in those awful shoes any longer. Something had to be done urgently. Find a painkiller. Today's lesson was, of course, over. The maid advised to put her tired feet in the water for now, and she ran to the mansion for help. The pain subsided a little thanks to the cool water. Of course, it was unpleasant, but nothing compared to life in Camorra. Suddenly, men's voices were heard somewhere nearby. They were discussing that Signor Cesare was planning to throw a party. Adele decided that they were noblemen, and they were heading straight for the fountain where the girl was sitting. She urgently needed to hide. The company continued to discuss the gossip, that Lucrezia had disappeared somewhere. After all, she was supposed to become Cesare's partner, and Mr. Della Valle ordered his daughter to slow down. Adele hid behind the massive sculpture in the center of the fountain. She was afraid to even breathe so as not to give herself away. It seemed that the young people had left, but suddenly someone called out from behind. With a lewd smile, they grabbed her by the arm. The unceremonious black-haired man pulled the girl, and she fell right into the fountain, immediately wetting all her clothes. Someone from the company said that the guy was overdoing it, but he just smirked, pretended that the beauty had fallen herself. The men came closer. The black-haired man reasoned that the girl did not look like either a noblewoman or a lady. After all, they would not stand in the fountain without shoes on their feet, but the clothes were too expensive for a maid or a worker. Adele was silent. After all, it looked like the guy was drunk. He clearly took her for an easy girl, and he did not hesitate to shout insults and threaten to hit her. The friends tried to stop the raging guy. After all, they were in the Bonaparte estate. But the dark-haired man assured that the master had no relation to the maid. He laughed that Bonaparte had really already become king. The girl tried to pull her hand away, and in a stern voice she ordered to let it go. Her manner of speaking was similar to that of an aristocrat. The company couldn't figure out who this thing was. They asked each other who it could be, either a maid or a prostitute who secretly snuck into a rich house. And there's a lot of work for someone like that right now. The beauty struggled. Then the one who held her shouted loudly that such a girl would not be able to get human relations from the bastard Cesare, so no need to pretend. Let him get down to his usual work, there are plenty of clients. And then everyone saw Cesare approaching the company. The young people immediately calmed down. The dark-haired man bowed to the gentleman. The owner of the estate immediately recognized the bully. It was Henry Fetch, the one who was shouting about the bastard Cesare. But there was no talk about the master at all. The owner continued, "The head of the Fetch family will be informed about what happened, and he will most likely not be happy about this story. After all, the Fetch family experienced some financial difficulties, and they came to the Bonaparte estate more than once, all for the sake of trying to gain the favor of Mr. Cesare, and to get some money on loan. Even this time he brought Madame for this purpose." The bully couldn't stand these words, and he almost attacked Cesare. At the same time, he shouted that he had crossed the line. But the gentleman was unperturbed, treating the younger sister of the heir to Bonaparte like a prostitute. That's what it means to cross the line. The whole company froze in place. No one believed their ears. Cesare's younger sister, but he was the only child in the family. Cesare said the name. Adelaide Bonaparte, his younger sister. And he stepped right into the fountain, holding out his hand to the girl. He took off his jacket, sewn by the best craftsman, and threw it over the shoulders of the beauty. He asked how such a story happened. In a few words, the girl said that she was just soaking her feet in cool water and enjoying the singing of birds. Until these three came. The boys began to say in turn that everything about the sister was a lie. Every sea fish knows that Cesare has no brothers or sisters. The gentleman looked at the company with a stern look and said that now there is. His parents still had true love. And anyway, it is not proper for the Lord to start explaining. The young people did not want to conflict with such an influential gentleman, and they began to babble excuses. It is difficult to recognize a lady and a girl sitting in a fountain. After all, she was sitting barefoot with wounded feet. Adele was embarrassed and muttered an apology in a quiet voice. After all, she was afraid of disgracing the Bonaparte family and trained very hard. That's why her legs suffered. And the girl sent the maid Effie to the mansion for help. After all, she could no longer walk on her own. And it was impossible to even think that something like this could happen in the Bonaparte estate. Cesare leaned over and picked the girl up in his arms. He quietly whispered in her ear that there was no shame, and that she should not overdo it in her studies. But Adele was very afraid of becoming a laughingstock in high society. This would cast a shadow on the entire Bonaparte family. The young man gently touched her forehead with his lips. There should be no such conversations between loving relatives. The girl was taken aback. She had never heard anything like that in her entire life, even as a joke. It was probably customary for aristocrats to behave like that with their loved ones. She was pretending to be the heiress of a noble family after all. So she thanked her brother with a kiss on the cheek, as was customary in society. Cesare played along with his sister, also responding in an appropriate manner. The company came alive again. It seemed that she really was Cesare's sister. They even looked very similar, and amber eyes and dark thick hair. Finally, the young gentleman decided to completely embarrass the company. Like maybe they want to have some fun with their little sister. They babbled that they were wrong. They tried to stop the bully Henry, and they didn't know that the lady was Cesare's younger sister. It turned out that it was possible to behave in this way with any other girl. And again there were apologies. The young man decided to end the conversation. He said that he forgives impudent people. Perhaps he too could accidentally torment some young lady, maybe from their families. And the gentleman hopes for forgiveness, because it will be out of ignorance. The young people did not like this at all, but there was nothing to be done. The gentleman never got the girl to her feet. He carried her in his arms along the park alley, and she held tightly to the man's broad shoulder. Several pairs of curious female eyes were watching this scene from afar. So the man with the girl in his arms approached the front entrance of the mansion. Suddenly, the mood changed dramatically. Why should he do all this nonsense? Adele decided that the gentleman was just tired. She wished to descend from the strong arms to the ground, but unbearable pain pierced her wounded feet, and she collapsed to the floor. Just a walking disaster. The gentleman asked where the maid was. The lady reminded him that she had gone to get help. Perhaps she would bring a wheelchair so that he could move around. This made Cesare angry. After all, he didn't hire a cripple who couldn't even walk. The girl stammered an apology for the terrible scene at the fountain, that she had never expected to meet anyone in the garden. Suddenly the man stepped on the girl's sore foot with his boot. Tears gushed from her eyes from the unbearable pain. And Cesare said such words that you just wanted to die. That the girl was probably in the garden for a reason. Probably to have fun with a bunch of men. Or maybe it's an old habit that remained from the slums. Or some other circumstances. due to which something incomprehensible happened in Bonaparte's garden. Suddenly, a wave of anger washed over the girl lying on the floor. Her hands clenched into fists and her whole body became like a spring. That is, the gentleman thinks that it was she who provoked that terrible scene in the park. Seduced the impudent men. Yes, he thought so. But it was not so at all. The girl raised herself up on her hands and silently looked into Cesare's eyes. But he only burst out laughing. It seems that Madame Flavia had a strong influence on the student. She simply suppressed all the will of this unfortunate girl, neither engage in verbal sparring, nor curry favor or flirt. A lady has so many options in her arsenal, but this pathetic person is only good at pleading, and completely throwing away her pride. That's what she did that time in the park. She allowed this to happen, but she could have stood up for herself. Of course, the gentleman is right, and she was not careful enough. The sense of danger did not work at the most necessary moment. Signor Cesare turned away, and contemptuously said that the girl should treat the wounds and heal the feet, so that no traces would remain. The maid Effie appeared in the open door. The sight that met her eyes was horrifying. After all, she was very worried about her charge. She tried to say something to the young gentleman, but he was too angry, and he abruptly interrupted her in mid-sentence. He also insisted that classes be cancelled for 3 days, and without saying another word, he left. The maid looked at the girl lying on the floor with pity. She understood how difficult it was for her to learn. Cesare sat at his desk in his office. He lit an expensive cigar and sorted through the papers on the table. In front of him lay a portrait of the bully from the park. Henry Fetch, the second son in the family without inheritance rights, a man of absolutely no worth. And this nonentity did such things in Bonaparte's garden. It was urgently necessary to sort this matter out to the end. The whole plan went awry. Adelaide's identity was revealed, which meant there was no other candidate to play the role of sister. Now it was simply necessary to turn a simple shoeshiner into a true Bonaparte, at any cost. A morning picture in the garden came to mind, clearly provocative. That luxurious hair in the water, like emerald seaweed, salt white skin, wet clothes that almost allowed you to see your chest. Those bastards must have remembered the smallest details. Although he also remembered the tender kiss of gratitude for saving him, and the large amber eyes, which seemed to look into his very soul. If even Cesare fell for it, the game would be played out to the end. Ezra della Valle only needs to see such a nymph. There was a knock at the door of the office. It was Madame the teacher. She greeted Monsieur Bonaparte, wishing him the protection of the goddess. The gentleman just wanted to talk about his ward. He wasn't interested in teaching methods at all, but he shouldn't be too zealous. Madame apologized and wanted to present her arguments, but the gentleman interrupted the tirade before it began. No one dared bother him. Madame Flavia had no choice but to leave her study. Her thoughts occupied her entire journey to her room. This impudent shoeshiner turned out to be no ordinary thing. She deliberately exhausted herself. She trained her gait until she wore out all her feet. As a result, she put the teacher in the worst light. This could have gotten into the disfavor of the gentleman. Meanwhile, in the park gazebo, a different story was unfolding. Young girls were gossiping about the morning incident. It turned out that Cesare had a lover, most likely a commoner. She was sitting in the fountain completely barefoot early in the morning. After all, the gentleman wouldn't get involved with a noble lady, although tastes change. In any case, the relationship between these two is not the most ordinary, and the ladies' man was very kind, much more kind than usual. He carried her into the central wing, but Cesare never let girls there. "Who is this impudent woman?" asked the red-haired girl with cute long curls. "Lady Genevieve." She was the most animated in discussing the details of what had happened. Citing poor health, she hurried to leave the flock of girls, and almost ran towards the mansion. After all, it was necessary to urgently inform Lucretia about everything. In the candlelight, a quill with a carved pattern flickered over the paper. Genevieve was writing a letter to her friend. It was reported that a dark cloud hung over the future of Lady Lucrezia. Today it became known that Mr. Cesare was caught in the park with a girl in his arms, and he carried her to the main wing of the mansion. It was unknown who the girl was who had lured the gentleman. It was also written that Genevieve wanted to meet the lady as soon as possible, and to give her consolation. Having summoned the maid, she handed over a letter sealed with sealing wax, with the order to urgently deliver it personally to the hands of Lady Lucrezia della Valle. As soon as the letter was delivered, Lucretia began to read it greedily. The utter nonsense was written by her friend. Was Mr. Cesare really going to test his bride again? It couldn't be. And the letter flew straight into the flames of the burning fireplace. News spread rapidly throughout the estate. Everyone was discussing only one thing. Mr. Cesare was hiding his beloved in the main wing. Orcane's delegation saw him carefully carrying an unknown girl in his arms. Tenderness shone through in every movement. It was also said that Henry Fetch paid for his behavior. Bonaparte demanded a huge sum of money back, that his family had invested in the Fetch family business. And of course, everyone wondered who the girl was with whom the famous womanizer Cesare Bonaparte fell in love. This was too much. Madame Flavia was furious. Rumors about the shameless girl had reached her too. The honor of the Bonaparte family could be tarnished. It was necessary to get rid of this insidious and impudent commoner as soon as possible. With a menacing shout, the teacher opened the doors of her students' chambers and walked quickly inside the room. She immediately stood up and greeted Madame, also politely inquired about her health. She wished for the blessing of the goddess. The enraged teacher couldn't believe her eyes. After all, only 3 days had passed since their last lesson, and the girl had noticeably become prettier. The sunken cheeks began to round out, and the wounds and bruises on the body practically disappeared. Now the student resembled a maiden from ancient legends who lured sailors to the bottom of the sea. Madame Flavia loudly told of the talk in every corner of the estate, of the unseemly appearance of a shameless woman before gentlemen. After all, she should have been sitting quietly in the mansion, correcting her gait, and not sitting in the fountain barefoot and soaking wet. Adele offered her sincere apologies. She herself was not happy about what happened. But then the maid asked permission to say a few words. Effie was present in the room and heard everything. In her opinion, the student has already honed her gait sufficiently, and it meets all the standards of high society. Therefore, it may be worth moving on to the next stage of training, so that the lady can learn new useful skills. Madame raised an eyebrow. It seemed that the impudent girl had moved Effie to her pity and drawn her over to her side, and Mr. Cesare was watching the training process. It was necessary to adapt to the situation and find a more thoughtful way to get rid of the impudent shoeshine girl. However, the next lesson also showed that the student was trying her best. She grasped everything on the fly and took into account every detail. And this was very different from other girls. They would go into hysterics at any difficulty. But here Madame had absolutely nothing to find fault with. That same evening, Madame Flavia was resting in her chambers and thinking about the situation that had arisen. Suddenly someone said hello. Lucrezia della Valle entered the room. It was not for nothing that she was called the first beauty in high society, the ideal lady whom everyone looked up to. Madame inquired what business had brought the young lady to the Bonaparte mansion. What was the reason for the unexpected visit? She heard that the cream of society had arrived here. The servants were running off their feet. It seemed that a lavish reception was planned for the delegation from Orcanine. It is known that Mr. Cesare has close ties to the Orcanean Empire. Not long ago, he even helped the new emperor ascend to the throne. The girl asked if everything was all right with the gentleman. After all, the lady had not been out in public for some time. Therefore, she could not see him. Madame realized that the rumors had reached the Della Valle estate, and Lady Lucrezia was nervous about it. After all, she had long adored the gentleman. Madame Flavia decided to reveal some details of this story, to hint to Lucretia about the family connection between the two. Suddenly a thought flashed through her mind that had been bothering the teacher lately, about how to drive the impudent commoner out of the estate. Let Lucretia help with this. After all, Madame was under the close control of the master, and she had already received one warning, and Lady Lucrezia was elegance itself, and she was directly interested in her place as Cesare's bride. Madame looked intently into the eyes of the young lady, and carefully choosing her words, she began her story. That the girl about whom there were rumors is a direct relative of the gentleman, the daughter of Madame Caterina and Monsieur Rohan Bonaparte. Lady Lucretia blushed. It turned out that she had been very much mistaken about the whole story. However, Madame Flavia clarified some details. Madame Adelaide Bonaparte is the younger sister of Monsieur Cesare, although in reality its origin is not fully known. After all, you can't ask Caterina and Rohan Bonaparte directly. A transparent hint was given. Then the lady could compare the parting words herself and draw conclusions for herself. Lucretia sincerely wished Madame the blessing and protection of the goddess. After all, thanks to this conversation, many things could be understood and compared. It was morning tea time. The young lady was enjoying a beautifully brewed herbal tea with a variety of desserts. The maid insisted that a morning walk was necessary. After all, it was part of the daily routine. However, Adele was against it. Fear was overwhelming her after everything that had happened in the park. To avoid meeting the guests, you could take a walk towards the water garden. There was a huge hydrolide there. It would amaze the lady to the depths of her soul. The girl softened a little. Perhaps the maid felt ordinary pity for her, and she sincerely thanked Effie for her concern. The park was truly beautiful. The fountain cascades were striking in their scope. Numerous water sculptures decorated the composition. The marble gods and goddesses seemed alive. Adele, accompanied by her maid, admired the fountains, and the air filled with moisture brought relief to her wounded heart. There was already someone at one of the fountains. Lady Lucrezia della Valle, accompanied by her companion, greeted them. Adele curtsied deeply. It was almost perfect. She wished for the blessing of the goddess. Lucretia said she did not remember meeting the young lady in salons or at balls. The interlocutor said she had not yet made her debut in high society. Then the noble lady gave her full name, Lucrezia of the Della Valle family, and she raised an eyebrow questioningly at the young lady. This was the very moment that the simple shoe shiner had been so afraid of. But she gathered her courage, and she imagined that her name was Adelaide Bonaparte. The guest seemed genuinely surprised. Perhaps this was a new joke that had spread through high society. After all, the lady had only recently returned to society. Adele dispelled doubts. She really belongs to the Bonaparte family. However, due to certain circumstances, she grew up separately from her older brother Cesare. The interlocutor was even more surprised. It turns out that the lady lives in the same mansion as Mr. Cesare, in the main wing of Bonaparte, and then she offered the young lady the opportunity to travel, to leave Fornati and explore different corners of Saint-Nar. The girl muttered that she still planned to stay close to her family, here in the Bonaparte estate. There was a pause. Adele could not read the expression on the face of such a beauty. Perhaps she was just nervous, or because her interlocutor was a real lady. Having said a quick farewell, Lucretia wished the young lady protection from murderers in the skies and waters, and she walked away quickly. The maid's face clearly showed concern. Mrs. Della Valle knew something. The words spoken at parting were disturbing. The master needed to be informed about this urgently. Even if Lady Lucretia does not enter into open confrontation with the young master, however, the reefs can be more terrible than the waves. The carriage, drawn by 2 horses, moved briskly in the light of the setting sun. The lady and her assistant Hazel were leaving the estate. Lucrezia consulted with her companion. She did not know what to do in this situation. It seemed that Mr. Cesare had once again fallen in love with some harlot. She did not understand the reason for the alarm. After all, it turned out that Adelaide was the younger sister of Mr. Bonaparte. However, the girl was adamant. The hands of the girl from the park could not belong to a noble lady. It seems that Cesare hated his bride so much that he brought a girl from the street and called her his little sister. And if that rogue doesn't manage to keep Mr. Cesare, she will probably want to marry Lucrezia's brother. Something had to be done urgently, before this harlot took away Mr. Cesare. Besides, she could become a member of the Della Valle family. Hazel insisted that they had to find a way to drive the girl away themselves. However, Lady Lucretia did not want to make a mistake and cause harm to anyone. Then the companion promised her help. The lady did not expect such a gift, and she was sincerely glad that there was such a devoted person nearby. The line of carriages, drawn by 2 horses, stretched for 100 meters. The driveway of the Bonaparte estate was covered with coats of arms of various wealthy families. Many noble gentlemen and ladies were honored to be invited to a social reception at the Bonaparte estate. The servants were running off their feet. Every now and then the butler's orders about decorating the tapestries and arranging flowers could be heard. Adele watched from the high stairs as the proceedings progressed. The nervous atmosphere of the upcoming reception affected everyone. Sometime later she decided to talk to Signor Cesare, and she resolutely headed towards his office. She knocked lightly on the door. But then she remembered the rule that forbade knocking on the door of the owner's office. Slightly embarrassed, the girl opened the door and saw 2 young men. Her brother was sitting at the table, and behind him stood an unfamiliar red-haired man. He stopped sorting through the papers and told the gentleman that he had a visitor. Cesare raised his head, and with a smile asked how Adelaide was feeling. Had the wounds on her feet healed? The girl was embarrassed but thanked him for his concern, and said that everything had gotten better. The wounds and blisters had almost healed. With a cynical smile, the gentleman said that he was not at all worried about his sister, but she only paid a tribute to politeness. Cesare raised an eyebrow in surprise and asked why the girl had come to his office. The young lady gathered her courage and smiled, and asked for the opportunity to attend today's reception. Cesare had not expected that his sister could be so sweet. The young man standing next to him did not understand who this lady was, who had entered the office without permission and was asking the gentleman such questions. Then the gentleman introduced his younger sister Adelaide. In response, he introduced Mr. Cesare's personal secretary, Gigi Manfredi. This red-haired guy was very smiling. He added that he was also the deputy manager of the Stallone Corporation, Cesare Buonaparte's company. The young man was struck by Adele's beauty, as if a sea nymph had swum from the depths of the sea, but he did not show it, and continued to talk about business with the gentleman. The girl thought about it. They had known each other for several days. However, it seemed that during this time, several layers had already been cut off from the delicate soul. But the girl still decided to forget about that unfortunate day, when the gentleman stepped on her wounded foot and said terrible words. Cesare suddenly asked if his sister had seen Lucrezia. It was allegedly reported that the young lady had received a noble warning. The maid Effie knew a lot more about small talk than the shoeshine girl on the street. After the reception is over, the master will assign a brochure to the sister, a servant who accompanies noble ladies up to the age of 18 when they leave the house. The conversation was over and the embarrassed girl left the office. In appearance and manners, she was already almost an elegant lady. However, the dialogue continued between the two men. The assistant reminded that the brochure would arrive only in 2 days. This means the young lady will be unattended during the reception, at which Lucrezia will also be present. The gentleman thought about it. After all, nothing bad could happen in Bonaparte's estate. However, he ordered Manfredi to prepare one galley, and let the ship be as old as possible. The assistant was extremely dissatisfied with the work and worries that had fallen on him. However, he did not dare to say anything out loud. Every now and then, in the lavishly decorated halls, social conversations were held. That Flavia Loredan had also arrived for the reception. It turned out that Mr. Cesare had summoned her again. Although Loredan had long since lost the confidence of Monsieur Bonaparte, perhaps there was an intention to return Madame to the pedestal of high society. The Loredan family lost its position for a short time. However, Madame the teacher decided to stay close to Bonaparte to improve her position. She was brought out of her thoughts by the voice of Lady Lucretia. She started a small talk about how everything at the ball was at the highest level. After all, this reception was organized by Bonaparte himself. The exquisite furnishings and decorations are chosen with taste. Undoubtedly, Mr. Cesare has a refined sense of beauty. Then Lucretia switched to a whisper. She suggested talking about the things that needed to be gotten rid of from this beautiful mansion. Madame was noticeably embarrassed. Fear flashed in her eyes. She could add nothing to the previous conversation that took place on the day of Lady Lucretia's arrival. Then the girl hinted that perhaps it was worth talking about this matter with Mr. Cesare, and to tell about the revelations that I received from Madame the teacher of etiquette concerning the origin of Lady Adelaide Bonaparte. Madame was beside herself. She could not understand how this could happen. After all, she favored Lady Lucretia and trusted her. But the treacherous lady only said that she was very upset. After all, Mr. Cesare trusted Madame, and she revealed their common secret. The lady smiled charmingly, but there was ice in her eyes. She did not wish to confront Madame Flavia. She only wanted a little help in their common cause. Everything will be kept in the strictest confidence. It was pitiful to look at the teacher. Her face was distorted by a grimace of hatred. She had inadvertently led herself into a trap. She said through her teeth, looking at her wily interlocutor, that she agreed. The atmosphere in the estate was solemn and joyful at the same time. The sounds of music could be heard in different corners. In the ballroom, couples were dancing. Gentlemen in formal tailcoats and beautiful ladies in dresses of every possible color. Adele sat in front of a large mirror. The maid reported that the reception had already begun. Along the way, she helped to style her hair into an elegant hairstyle. The young lady was worried that she was holding up Effie, but she was in no hurry. After all, she was not an aristocrat, and her presence at the reception was not obligatory. Seeing how the girl was worried, she asked the reason. The ward was upset that everyone would see her shortcomings and flaws. But the young lady was simply beautiful, and if such a beauty appeared in the ballroom, everyone would turn in her direction. Adele did not fully trust her assistant. Any miscalculation and the social sharks would sink their teeth into the victim. Effie decided to cheer up the debutante. After all, preparation for the reception can be more interesting than the reception itself. Lady Bonaparte never wears the same outfit twice. Hat, umbrella, dress, jewelry, and even stockings. All this was bought new each time. So you will need to visit Bella Stella Street every day. Even as a shoe shiner, the girl knew about this street. But she had never been there. That place was too shining and beautiful. And she felt that she had no right to go there. Even the names of the boutiques resembled lines from romantic poems. The maid's words excited the beauty very much. She wanted to ask again and again about this wonderful place, and imagine herself among the beautiful shop windows and signs. Suddenly someone knocked on the bedroom door. The ladies weren't expecting anyone, and at the same time they were wary. Madame Flavia stood on the threshold. She had an unusual appearance, a sidelong glance and a slightly wrinkled collar, as if she was in a hurry to get somewhere. She turned to Effie. That Mrs. Eva wanted an additional report regarding Mr. Cesare. For this, the maid's notes are needed. Therefore, she had to go with Madame immediately. Effie returned to the bedroom for a second and reported an urgent matter. Something was bothering her assistant, but from behind the door, Madame hurried her. After all, the chairwoman was expecting her report, and the maid hurried away. Adele decided to read a little. She took a book and sat down on an elegant ottoman. Barely audible music was coming from the ballroom. But her dreams led her to Bella Stella Street. The girl was so excited that she couldn't read a single line, or even connect the letters into words. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. Effie couldn't have come back that quickly. She wondered who it could be then. Someone's voice insistently said that it was not necessary to open. It was simply shouting, warning of danger. Adele looked around. There was no one in the room except her. It was unclear what kind of voice it was. There was another knock on the door. And suddenly the door opened. In the doorway stood an unfamiliar girl with a cap pulled low over her eyes. It looked like a servant from the mansion. At least the uniform said so. She asked for forgiveness, for entering without waiting for permission. But the situation did not tolerate delay. She said that the owner urgently called his sister. Someone's voice kept repeating the danger. Something was wrong. The maid looked too young. The clothes were clearly too big. However, Cesare could have called his sister, perhaps to give some parting words before going out into the world. And she agreed. She threw a silk stole over her shoulders, and the maid quickly led the girl up the stairs. She said that the master was waiting on the roof. Adele slowed down a little. The voice was already screaming in her head, and her legs refused to follow the maid, although she thought differently. Cesare would not reveal his plans to some servant. Therefore, everything seemed plausible. At the very end of the stairs, the girl announced that they had arrived, and she opened the door leading to the roof. The wind was quite strong. The unbraided hair was fluttering. The girl went out onto a small terrace on the roof. But the gentleman was not there. Then she turned to the maid to find out what was going on. But someone's strong hands pushed her in the back. There was no way to stay on the edge. And Adele flew down. The girl in the cap remained standing on the roof of the Bonaparte mansion. Meanwhile, 1,000,000 candles were burning in the ceremonial hall. Pleasant music was playing. Wine was flowing like a river. Everyone was congratulating the Duke. Such an incredible man. The youngest person to become a prior. Moreover, he was recently able to put a prince of a neighboring country on the throne. The current emperor was a cousin of Mr. Cesare, so the political benefits were obvious. The right to vote in parliament was very powerful. The young gentleman was from a good family, handsome, with excellent business acumen and political instinct. A darling of fortune. Everyone was wondering who this handsome man would marry. Lucrezia della Valle, it seems, will soon put the ring on him. Cesare got tired of the noise and decided to smoke a cigar on the balcony, to be away from these looks and whispers for a while. The gold of his dress uniform glittered in the moonlight. Finally, he could be in silence. Suddenly my gaze fell upon a barely noticeable inscription on the balcony vault. Someone had written it with charcoal on the light vault. There were only 2 letters. K.R. Catherine and Rohan Bonaparte, Cesare's parents. On ball days, these two always danced together, and little Cesare was seated on the most luxurious chair in the ballroom, and cookies were given to his hands. Then they could be in their own world for a few hours, where they belonged only to each other, and no one was able to stop them. His friend's voice pulled him out of his pleasant memories. He opened the window and shouted to Cesare that all the ladies were waiting for his return. The young man wore an exquisite silk stole over his shoulders. Cesare laughed. Jude had come to the reception he had given wearing a silly shawl. The friend started to fool around. He said he was going about his business, and the shawl fell on his shoulders by itself. It fell from the sky. A lucky chance can create destiny. When Cesare gets rid of Lady Lucrezia, he will give his heart to a suitable girl. Perhaps this shawl will decide the fate of the young gentleman. A randomly chosen thing will change his future life. The master of the house did not remain silent. It turns out that it is impossible to choose another girl as a bride because of Lucretia, fearing that she will destroy the chosen one. Suddenly, the young man saw an exquisite embroidered monogram on the tip of the scarf. KB Katharina Bonaparte. This thing belonged to his mother, and now Adele uses it. But how could this shawl fall from the sky? It was urgent to ask Jude where and when he had picked up the silk cape. And this is what happened on the roof. When someone pushed Adele in the back, she swayed and fell down. But miraculously, she managed to catch hold of the eaves of the roof, and she was holding on to the very edge with just her fingers. But now she could clearly see who had pushed her. It was the little maid, and the lady immediately remembered her. This is the companion who accompanied Lady Lucretia, and it seems that it was she who made her companion do this. The maid was standing at the very edge, and the lady was hanging from the eaves of the roof, and there was no one nearby to help. Then Adele began to ask for her hand. She insisted that all the blame for what had happened would fall on Lucretia, and not on the maid, and that Lady Della Valle will not leave alive anyone who is privy to this matter. She will kill him so that no one will know the truth. The maid clearly didn't expect this. She didn't think about the consequences of her actions. But these words seemed to be true. However, either fear prevailed or love for her mistress. The maid stepped on Adele's wrist with her heel. Let her die. And the girl flew down, into the darkness of the night, into the bony clutches of death itself, straight to the projecting balcony, where Mr. Cesare smoked his cigar, the youngest prior, the head of the Bonaparte family, gifted with the blessing of the gods, found himself lying on the balcony floor, crushed by his sister who had fallen on top of him. She seemed to be fine. There were no visible wounds on her body. Tears were streaming from her large amber eyes. The girl held onto the young man's chest as if she was afraid to let go, but she suddenly pulled away when he noticed it. She said that a girl dressed in the uniform of a servant of the mansion pushed from the roof. She said that the master called his sister. He was extremely surprised, especially when it turned out that the lady recognized the girl. It was Lucretia's maid, his bride. Jude immediately ran to the roof, but the criminal was too fast, and he couldn't catch up with her. He shouted this from the roof to Cesare. Naturally, the girl had already disappeared by this time. The gentleman muttered, still holding his sister's hand, who had fallen from the sky like a sea wave. By the way, the girl was wearing a thin cambric undershirt, and in such an immodest form she intended to come to her brother's room. Adele was embarrassed. Her cheeks were on fire. She hadn't had time to get dressed, but the matter was urgent, and her shawl had flown away when she fell from the roof. Cesare was so angry about what happened. He couldn't contain his emotions. But the girl was thinking about something and didn't react to her brother's attacks. It was necessary to urgently cover up the inappropriate appearance of the beauty. Cesare took off his dress jacket and threw it over her thin shoulders. It was obvious that every movement caused pain to the young man. The gentleman groaned and grabbed his side with his hand. Traces of blood were clearly visible on his shirt. The sister almost choked on what she saw, and she leaned closer to examine the wound. She asked sympathetically about how he was feeling. The brother smiled, despite the pain. The shoe shiner had been through a lot herself in the last few days. Now she was asking about his health. Perhaps she forgot how his boot stepped on her sore foot. Or about the hurtful words spoken in a fit of anger. How the young man wanted this girl to court him. He even had indecent images in his head, but someone was already running towards them. It was a friend who had come down from the roof. Jude was very worried about his master and his sister. In the office, the doctor examined Cesare's wound. The huge bruise on his side looked very scary. Luckily, the internal organs were not seriously injured. However, physical activity should be avoided for some time. And of course, during the recovery period, you need to stop smoking cigars. Cesare cursed, but the doctor was adamant. From tomorrow onwards, it is necessary to apply compresses daily. The doctor will send a person, but his patient refused, saying that he should leave everything necessary for the procedures. Adele understood why she had to follow the unknown maid. It was all because of Cesare's attitude to business. Suddenly, the office door swung open, Effie flew into the room without knocking, shouting that the lady was missing and that she was looking for her charge. But then the maid saw Adele, in an inappropriate form and in a terrible state. The gentleman smiled slightly, and told what happened on the roof of the mansion, and then on that ill-fated balcony. It was a pity to look at Effie. It was all because of her carelessness that she had to leave her charge alone. Although doubts about the veracity of the teacher's words immediately crept into my head, it was alarming that the lady urgently needed a report during the reception. Cesare did not accuse the maid of negligence. After all, Madame Flavia herself came for her, and allegedly conveyed the mistress's order. It was impossible to suspect her. Jude entered the room. Everyone present immediately turned their gaze to the red-haired young man. He reported that by order of the Lord, the knights were to imprison Madame Flavia Loredan. Also, anyone who tried to leave the estate would be detained. Cesare was pleased with the order carried out, and he asked his assistant if the galley was ready. He confirmed it. Then it was necessary to send it to dear Madame Flavia. Cesare said these words with feeling and put out his cigar, and now he demanded that Lucretia be brought to him, and as soon as possible. A long conversation lay ahead. There was a knock at the door. Adele immediately remembered the rule: don't knock on your brother's office door. Now the reason for this was clear. Only a stranger was knocking at the door. It was like a conventional sign warning of danger, and it gave time to prepare. The gentleman ordered his sister to sit next to him on the sofa, and to move as close as possible. It was announced that Lucrezia della Valle had arrived. She had an angelic look. Her hands were folded submissively on her skirts. Her eyes were half lowered. The gentleman apologized for meeting Lady della Valle in such a state. After the doctor's examination, his torso was naked. The girl raised her eyes, and before her appeared a picture that shocked her. On the sofa sat a gentleman with his sister. Lucretia stuttered, only able to squeeze out the traditional greeting to the master, and stood there, unable to move. Cesare gestured to his bride to sit down on the sofa. She did not dare refuse, although her legs did not quite obey. There was a little maid next to Lucretia, and it was clearly a different girl. Adele immediately noticed that the lady had already managed to change the maid. The gentleman immediately paid attention to this. He asked if the lady had always had this girl as a maid. She confirmed, yes, a niece's maid. Cesare was starting to get angry. Only Lucrezia could lie and evade so brazenly, but she stood her ground. It was this assistant who had been serving him all the time. The lady nervously fingered her cape, and demanded that the little girl confirm her words. She certainly fulfilled her mistress's will. The gentleman noticed Lucretia's quick movements. If it weren't for the marriage story, she would have made an ideal business partner. The lady blushed and thanked him. Cesare couldn't believe his ears. She pretended nothing had happened. It felt like this person had already forgotten the recent murder attempt, and all her thoughts were focused only on the young master, as if she was out of her mind. Finally, Lucrezia noticed the appearance of Mr. Cesare, and the wound on his side. It seemed that he had suffered greatly. Cesare turned slowly to Adele. Amber eyes met the same female eyes. He said he had to catch a mermaid falling from the sky. That's why he got injured. But now everything is fine. Lady della Valle didn't know what to say. The situation had clearly gotten out of hand, but she immediately came to her senses. She smiled sweetly, her most charming smile, and offered to help take care of the young master. The gentleman refused the services, cynically said that Lady Lucretia was not guilty of what had happened, and therefore it was not worth burdening her. Besides, the younger sister is always nearby, and is quite capable of taking care of her brother. The cunning schemer had an answer for everything. It is impossible for an old maid to be in the same bedroom with a gentleman, and to court him. There will be gossip in society. But Cesare was adamant. This was his younger sister, and she had the right to be in this house wherever she wanted. He looked at Adele and added slyly, "It's even a pity to give such a beauty to Della Valle's older brother." Then he looked sternly at Lucretia. This time he promised not to connect her person with what happened. But there won't be a second time, and if the lady has something else in mind, there will be no mercy. The proceedings will then move to the interclan level. Tears flowed from Lucretia's eyes. Her pitiful appearance did not move anyone to pity. It only caused disgust. Meanwhile, the teacher was in the room under the supervision of armed guards. She had no doubt that Lucrezia's plan had failed, and the shadow now fell on Madame Flavia as well. Suddenly, the side door opened slightly, and a man in a dark cloak appeared through the narrow gap, with a low-pulled hood. In accordance with the order of the head of the Bonaparte family, Madame Flavia Loredan was to follow him.